Hello, my name is Jonathan Greiner with Basin Safety Consulting and Training. This month, December 2020, we're going to be covering a few of the softer safety topics. This month, we're at the end of the year, we like to keep it a little bit shorter and focus on some of the health and safety manual topics rather than go deep into the operational. Keep it short, but topics that definitely need to be covered. So we're going to be covering drug and alcohol programs, disciplinary program, and sexual harassment, as well as other types of harassment. So session objectives this month will be to understand why drugs and alcohol are not allowed in the workplace. Hopefully this doesn't need a whole lot of discussion or convincing, but we're definitely going to cover why that is, as well as how they can affect you at work, understanding the purpose of a disciplinary program, and learning the steps of a disciplinary program are all going to be covered in this month's topic. So as far as drugs and alcohol use goes, these are covered in OSHA's General Duty Clause, which is 501 3C. So what it basically says is that employers must provide a safe work environment for workers. Now, when it comes to training and getting people up to speed on the safety manuals and the ways to do their job, that's pretty straightforward. When it comes to drugs and alcohol, it's a little bit more complicated because people can make decisions even outside of the workplace that can affect others at work. So this includes not allowing people to work while under the influence of drugs and alcohol, and obviously not to have them on their person at the workplace. So drugs and alcohol, being under the influence of them, can have many negative effects on a worker's ability to perform their job safely and effectively. And obviously, if you choose to use drugs or alcohol, you're putting everyone at risk, yourself, your coworkers, etc. Some common drug types out there are marijuana, cocaine, heroin is actually on a huge uptick right now, ecstasy, roofies, bath salts. Hopefully we're not roofing our coworkers. That's kind of a no-no, obviously, but some people use these for different purposes, and obviously all can have negative effects in the workplace. So legal drugs as well can have some concern here. Obviously with the recent legalization of marijuana in both Montana and South Dakota, this is going to take on a different tone in the near future. But as far as I know, all the oil and gas operators are considering marijuana not a medicinal allowed product at this point. That may change in the future, but as far as now, it is illegal. So therefore, using it in the workplace or even medicinally is not allowed. So prescription over-the-counter medications, even outside of marijuana or cannabis, can have negative effects. Pain medication, for example, a lot of those you can't operate heavy machinery. It slows down reaction time, prevents some complex thinking, fine motor functions, etc. And if you're on a medication that can negatively affect your ability, the doctor is going to tell you, like, hey, when using this, these are some things that you can't do. If you're not sure, definitely there's a lot of information online, but definitely let your HR representative or supervisor know if there's some prescription drugs that you're taking that could potentially affect you as a worker. So drug testing situations, what's going to call for a drug test? Obviously, most of us got a pre-employment drug test before we went to work. Our company had us, get tested, make sure that there wasn't any drugs or alcohol in our systems. Randoms can also happen both on site or at your facility, and those are typically run by a consortium. A company's employee list will be generated to a consortium, and then they'll pick at random, who gets tested. Now, some companies, just a random situation. Some people I know one guy who gets picked every month at his job for whatever reason. So, it's random. Sometimes the same person can get picked. And the reason for that is it's actually an algorithm that goes across many companies. So the same people can get picked. If we all wish the lottery worked like that, unfortunately it doesn't. But when it comes to drug testing, hopefully that's a test you can pass. Also, if you're involved in an accident of any type, your company may request that you take a drug test, and then also reasonable suspicion. What that means is that if for some reason behavior is erratic or shows symptoms and signs of drug use, and they may call, especially in the DOT world, someone to go get a drug test. When that happens, typically they're not going to tell you that. They're just going to say, "Hey, you've been selected for a drug test." When you first signed up with your company, they're going to have a drug and alcohol waiver typically that you're going to sign, and you're going to submit yourself to all these different types of tests. So a refusal to take a test, a shy bladder, etc., will be actually considered positive. If that ever happens, then they'll need to be a doctor consulted, brought in, make sure that there's nothing wrong with you, and that actually you're going to have to take another test and make sure that you can pass that one. So don't worry if that ever happens to you. There's a process for handling that. So obviously drugs and alcohol at work can negatively affect people. One thing, people being escorted off the property, being suspended potentially, being referred to counseling, termination, and legal prosecution depending on the severity and the nature of the accident involved, if there is an accident. So one thing I want to mention here about being referred to counseling, and we'll cover this a little bit later, but if you need help, most of the companies we work for have something called an employee assistance program. What that is it gives you the ability to reach out for help and say, hey, I'm really having a hard time getting drinking or some other substance abuse, whether it's prescription pain medication, et cetera, under grip here, and I really need help. And there's a pathway. There's a company here in North Dakota called Adapt. There's a few others that they'll assign you a counselor. It's very affordable to the company, typically a part of an insurance program or some other benefits package, and those people can help you. So I definitely want to encourage you to reach out prior to something happening rather than after, because at that point, there may not be a whole lot of leverage for you. So drug and alcohol use, bottom line, it's dangerous. People make decisions, as I mentioned before, slower reaction time, inability to use our fine motor functions effectively, and that can affect the workers around us. So, at first, for a lot of people that are engaging in this, they don't think it's very serious, but ultimately, long term, it all comes down to statistics. If somebody's working unsafely, eventually, at some point, it's going to catch up to you, because those microseconds that count when working in the oil field or construction industry, they can come back to haunt you if there's an opportunity for something to happen. Not to say that Murphy's Law is 100% accurate, but it basically states that if something can happen, it will happen. And can an accident happen? Yes, absolutely, accident can happen. And then we're going to prevent that by everything we can. But if somebody's using a substance that affects their ability to think clearly or react effectively, definitely can cause an accident or an injury. So alcohol on the job. I know that my grandfather was a safety guy, believe it or not, in the 70s. And his job was to bring the beer at the end of the shift. That's what they'd have him do. So the safety guy, hey, your job, you don't have to be out here all the time. Go to town, grab us a case of beer, and bring it out here so we can enjoy it at the end of the shift. Things have changed a little bit since the 70s, as we know. So drinking or being under the influence of alcohol while on the job during a shift can have serious effects on your ability to make safe decisions. As I mentioned, and most of us should be familiar with this, slowed reaction times, inability to use fine motor function skills, etc. Just like with drugs, you're putting everyone else on the job at risk. I mean, if people are expecting you to perform your job a certain way and you can't, and you're not, then they're going to misjudge your ability and potentially cause an accident. So drinking before the job, they typically say to wait 8 hours before you drive or go to work after drinking. Obviously, this depends. If you have half a beer, probably not going to affect your ability. I mean, off hours, probably not going to affect your ability to go to work the next day. But if you're not sober, definitely stay home. If it's consistently affecting your job, you definitely want to, as I mentioned, get help, because there is help out there available. And obviously, don't operate heavy equipment, vehicles, etc. Do high-risk jobs while under the influence of alcohol. Even being hungover can still potentially being considered drunk on the job. So as I mentioned, EAPs are out there, employee assistance programs. They're designed to help people with addiction, struggles at home, and even other counseling. Some EAPs handle things like divorces, financial issues, anger management, etc. So if there's something you feel in your life that's just not completely under control, and you want to help, definitely know that there's help out there. Obviously, people feel like there's a stigma for that. If I ask for help, that means I have a problem. I don't want to admit I have a problem, and it's kind of a vicious cycle. But definitely contact your supervisor or your human resources person and ask them about your company's EAP. It's challenging. I consider it heroic for somebody to just stand up and say, hey, look, I've got a problem. I need help. Some people may look down on you, but ultimately your livelihood and your job are at stake here, and there is help available if you reach out rather than wait till after an accident happens. So lastly, here on the drug and alcohol program, Never drinking and driving is obviously important. So North Dakota percentage of alcohol-related fatal motor vehicle crashes, in 24 through 2018, typically hovers right there around 37 to 40%. And you can kind of see that trend here from 14 to 18. So, 53 fatal crashes in 14, 33 in 18. Looks like it's dropping a little bit, which is great, trending downward, but still a lot of people driving and causing fatalities. That's really, one in about every 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, something like that. So, it does happen a lot in North Dakota, typically not from people on the job, but, it can happen. All right, so next we're going to move into disciplinary programs. And disciplinary programs, a lot of people think like this is about if, Billy talks back, a lot or complains a lot, like we got to discipline him. And that is true, but I want to focus a little bit more on how it's related to safety. So if you have an individual in your workplace who is consistently not following safety rules, typically depending on the position of that person, if it's a supervisor, we all know how that can cause problems if your supervisor doesn't really care about the safety program and allows things to get out of control, doesn't really follow what needs to happen in the field. We can have some serious issues. And so I just want to encourage you, if that's happening, definitely you want to have a sit down and encourage people to do the right thing, talk to the team and say, hey, how do we fix this problem? We got to come together. It doesn't always have to be argumentative or aggressive, but definitely want to have that conversation. And then obviously for, the level 1, level 2 employees, same thing. If somebody's consistently not following safety guidelines, there needs to be a process to say, hey, like we're serious about this. This isn't just, something we say for the show of it. We actually, want to keep everybody safe. And, most people in 2020 have kind of gotten behind that. There's a few holdouts who don't really see the value of safety. And I agree, safety in some aspects needs to improve, like the way it's approached, the way that we communicate certain things in the safety world. So it can definitely improve, don't get me wrong. But ultimately, the goal of getting everyone home in the same condition that they came in, it's a pretty valiant goal. No one's going to push against that. Sometimes the way it's done doesn't make sense. There's a lot of extra paperwork. That's something that Basin Safety is trying to help improve, so that we can not have to do mountains of paperwork to do a 30-minute job, but it actually kind of makes sense for the type of job we're doing. But in the meantime, definitely want everyone to be on board, making sure everyone goes home safe and does the extra work and puts in that extra effort to make sure that happens. And as far as disciplinary programs are concerned, has a process in place for working through situations where that doesn't happen. And obviously you want to catch this before an accident happens, not afterwards. So company disciplinary programs essentially are implemented so that people have a safe work environment. And if someone's not working safely, there's a way to sit down and talk about it. They provide actions against unwanted behaviors in the workplace. They're not designed to get workers in trouble, but actually provide avoidance, being prepared rather than reactionary to situations of unsafe work. And the goal of an effective disciplinary program is primarily to discourage employees from behaving in a manner that would put themselves or others at risk. And sometimes, as I mentioned, both my grandfathers were in the oil field. My dad was in the oil field, still is actually. Coming from an oil field family, things have definitely changed in the last, 30, 40 years in oil and gas, even just in North Dakota and across the United States as well as the world. And we're seeing, statistically that unsafe behaviors eventually have a negative output. So if we can change our behavior, especially in the way that we work as a team, kind of having a focus on that, we can improve, or reduce the likelihood of injuries and accidents. So some of the things that disciplinary programs typically cover, safety violations, punctuality, obviously fighting violence and harassment, sexual assaults, bullying, insubordination, theft, or drugs and alcohol on the job. The disciplinary program is going to encompass a lot of things, but I have safety violations here on top because, there's two different types of safety violations as far as I'm concerned. And OSHA kind of looks at it the same way. There's willful and there's, unknowing. Like, hey, this person didn't know that this was unsafe and we got to correct that. Versus somebody who's like, yeah, there's a better way, but I'm going to do it this way because it's going to save time, or we don't have all the tools we should have, so we're going to kind of skate by. And I know a lot of roustabouts, electricians, construction guys, pumpers, flowback guys, frac guys, drilling guys. Like, I know how it is in the field when you have to get a job done and maybe the company didn't provide you with the tools you needed or the safety equipment that you needed, but you need to get the job done. It's easy to kind of convince yourself that you're doing it really quickly and getting in and out of there really fast without having that equipment is going to be fine. And I've seen it. I know it gets done. In fact, a lot of my roustabout friends, coming back to those guys, they love to be able to MacGyver things. It's kind of their trade art is saying, hey, this wasn't the safest way, but we got it done. And it's a little bit of a ha-ha moment. As a safety guy, people love to give me those anecdotes. And as I mentioned, it is very much about the statistical likelihood, right? You may do it safe this time, or relatively safe. Nothing may happen this time. But when we willfully disregard safeguards, ultimately, statistically, something bad will happen. And we want to bring that number down by, using the right equipment. It sucks to have to go back to town or back to the shop to get a tool you forgot rather than using the wrong one. And we cover that in a different training topic presentation, so I'm not going to go in depth on that today. But, us choosing to do things in an excellent manner, having the right tools, having the right equipment, rather than kind of shortchanging it is important. So there's a process to this. Typically, we want a reminder, just a verbal kind of reminder, hey, man, put your PPE on, or hey, that's not the right tool for this job. Secondly is a verbal warning, like, hey, we're going to have a conversation now, a little bit more serious. Then a written warning, ultimately a suspension, and then finally a termination. For you supervisors out there, it's important to document these things when they happen. Because, if it's time to let somebody go because they're consistent. Now, don't get me wrong, you have the discretion to say, hey, we're terminating this guy. On the first instance, like there's a zero tolerance policy, and we'll talk about that in a minute. That's doable, but you also want to say, give people a chance depending on the nature and the severity. But you want to kind of help people understand. We want to coach each other to do a better job, not just ultimately just go right for termination, even though that can be tempting depending on the severity. And sometimes necessary. Don't get me wrong. But ultimately, we want to get to that. We want to help coach someone along prior to getting to the point where it's so serious that the only option is letting that person go. So, verbal warning, we're all pretty. This is pretty straightforward. Coaching them. Hey, these are some things you need to be doing differently. I'm looking at this. It's not quite the way we want it to be. It's not excellent. And really, that's the bar that I like to use, and it's kind of ingrained into Basin's culture. Is pioneering excellence every day. And a couple weeks ago, I was out on a job, and we were installing some fall protection equipment on a site for an operator. And we installed it, and we looked up, and it just didn't look right. It was safe, but it didn't have it wasn't as safe as it could be. I'll put it that way. So there were some other things that we could add to it, some different welds, putting it together, anchoring it a little bit more firm. And if I'd asked the question, is it good enough? The answer to that question would have been yes. When I asked the second question, is it excellent? My hand and I, we looked at each other and we're like, no, it's not excellent. And therefore, we changed the process, and we ended up removing some equipment and reinstalling it later. And it was a little bit more costly, took a little bit more time, but ultimately it was the safest possible system that we could install. And if you're having a question about how do you really determine whether or not it's the safest? Ask yourself, is it excellent? And I believe that excellence and quality go hand in hand with safety. You typically don't have those two things opposing each other. Speed, maybe, but definitely not quality. So written warning, this is typically going to reference, either an employment contract or some information you have. Typically is going to have a witness. It's like, we're writing down that we've had this conversation, and this is the second or third time. The next steps will be suspension, termination, etc. And you just kind of let them know, hey, look, this is serious. We're taking this seriously. Put in the file, etc., etc. The next step is suspension. So if somebody kind of continues to act in a negative way, typically it's without pay, and this is like the first consequence, right? Like, hey, like, we are willing to let you go. Like, your time is not necessary for this period of time because of the way that you've been behaving. Like, we don't need you that much, right? So improve, change the method in which you're approaching the job from a safety or other perspective, and improve. And this typically is it's a message. It's a strong message. And then lastly is termination. And as I mentioned, supervisors, you definitely want to document this process along the way. Coach the person. It shouldn't be like you're a screw up, you're a total piece of garbage, you're a 2020 person, whatever. We're starting to use that as a curse word now, by the way. But, instead of doing all that and just going hard after somebody, you can say, hey, these are the things we want you to improve. We want to coach you. We want to see you do better in this position and with this company. Then ultimately, if you get past all that and the person's still not willing to be a part of the team and really emphasize the team dynamic or the qualities and values that you have, at that point, termination needs to happen. Definitely want to do that with a HR rep or another supervisor. Document it, the reason, etc. Now, North Dakota's a no-fault state, so officially there can be no legal reaction for this. So you really can fire somebody for anything. Like, hey man, that hard hat, it's ugly, and it looks ugly on you. We don't need you anymore. Officially, perfectly legal. However, federally, through the Department of Labor, etc., they can make a case against you. So you want to document what's going on, not a CYA necessarily, but just like, hey, this is actually what happened with this individual, and really just make sure that everything is clear and crystal. Also for the person, not just for you, but also for that person. And sometimes it works. We've had individuals that we've suspended before got to that point, and we saw a big change in their behavior, in their performance, having taken them down this road. And I believe in it fully, thoroughly. You want to be serious about things and actually make an impact. So it should ultimately to improve that person, not to make them feel bad or stupid or incapable. Because morale is another important thing, and sometimes people don't want to say anything for the morale reason. But ultimately, if excellence is our goal, then it takes pushing people to strive to that. If you've ever played on a sports team, basketball, football, baseball, doesn't matter. I mean, if you don't listen to the coach, like, you're getting benched. And some coaches are afraid to bench, all-stars, really good people. And that happens in the field as well, where somebody's really good at their job, so even though they do some things that aren't, really helpful to the team or that are unsafe, they still are the rock star because they do a good job. I've seen that take companies down, though, over time. Statistically, incidents happen. They do a root cause and find, hey, this individual has a history of acting like this. So ultimately, if you kind of have that mentality, I get it. It's hard to bench your star player. You may look for another, place to go, but it's the best thing for the team if it's necessary. And all the great coaches do it. Some of the lesser coaches, they don't. But people who win championships, if you look at the way that they handle players like that, typically they have a method of, actually disciplining people. So supervisors and managers, what we want you guys to know, they should be fair for the action, be used equally on all employees. You don't want to have favorites and treat them different. Yelling or belittling employees, as I mentioned, isn't really going to help you very much. And then it's important, and I'm not always great at this as an owner, is making sure that all the expectations are very clearly known. Sometimes you have great employees and they operate in such a way that you're like, yeah, these guys know how to do it. And you have other employees who need much more explicit instructions. And, maybe if they need that level of instruction, they shouldn't be on the team in the first place. But ultimately, if you don't let your expectation be known, it's difficult for people to follow them. So obviously, depending on the severity of the behaviors, some are more severe, etc. Some can be illegal, and we talk about this in confined space work, in trenching and excavation, in lifting with cranes, etc. Some of those types of work, especially if you're in a supervisory role, there is zero tolerance from a federal level. Like, if you put someone in a confined space without the right equipment, you can be held criminally liable for that. Same thing with a trench, same thing with cranes. If you have guys walking around underneath the load like willy-nilly, working around power lines, etc., and you're not protecting them, they can hold you liable. Like, dude, you knew that 10,000 volts, if Billy's over here, the crane's right next to him, if he strikes that line, Billy's going to die, and that's on you as a supervisor because you knew that. Same thing with a trench collapsing on somebody and someone going inside of a space without gas monitors or a rescue plan, etc. So just kind of keep that in mind. So as I mentioned, in some instances, there's a zero tolerance policy. If certain things are done in a way that could potentially harm somebody, there is zero tolerance for it. Like, there is no, sit down and coaching. And, for example, Billy sets fire to the building. That's not hey, Billy, we got to talk about your, what do they call that? Your pyromania here. Let's have a discussion about it. That may be grounds for termination regardless. In other harassment, things like that. So from a harassment perspective, we'll talk about that briefly in our next slide, or our next 2 slides from now. Certain things, depending on how they treat people, it may just be a termination immediately. So just kind of keep that in mind. Same thing with drugs and alcohol. So a good disciplinary program, once again, kind of keeps everybody in the right mindset. It shows that there is a consequence for acting unsafely or doing things that could potentially harm people. Reporting all incidents to your supervisor immediately. And I know this is difficult. In the oil field, there's kind of an unwritten code that you don't tell on, your buddies. You don't tell on them. And I'm not saying that, Billy steps out of the truck with his hard hat and you're writing it down on a little notepad and sending an email to everyone, in the Lord. I'm not saying that. But definitely, coach them first, talk to them. And if it's just aggressive, like, don't tell me how to do my job, etc., you consistently see it. Eventually, that person is statistically going to get hurt or hurt somebody else with kind of a laissez-faire attitude. So just kind of keep that in mind. So reporting incidences when you see them, especially if the person isn't, willing to improve. Knowing the expectation of your company and supervisor, especially from a safety perspective. If you don't know, ask. So if you're somebody who's not in a supervisory position and you're thinking, I know there's a lot of safety stuff out here. Like, what's the most important in this situation? How do I behave? What's the proper process? I'm not 100% sure. You got to ask somebody. Don't expect always for supervisors and everybody to know your level because they may have worked with a lot of capable people before and not know that you need to know that. And that's no excuse for us managers and supervisors, but definitely it's a reality. So if you're in that situation, you don't know, ask somebody or ask a safety person or email me. Like, hey, John, I went through your training. You said to email me. This is my question. I'm not going to charge you, I promise, to help you walk through something or help your company walk through something. We're here to make sure everyone goes home safely. So harassment in the law, really briefly, from a harassment perspective, obviously, Title 7 is out there. This talks a lot about the Civil Rights Act, not hiring or firing based on race, gender, etc. The courts have also upheld a lot of things. People being treated like people at work. And if you look at DNA from a genetics perspective, and I'm not a huge geek on this, but I know a little bit. We're like 99.95% the same. Every single person, male, female, black, white, etc. We're all pretty much exactly the same. So treating people differently because of 0.05% of who they are, just it doesn't make any sense. So the courts are upholding that. Obviously, the Constitution upholds that, etc. State law definitely is going to play into this as well. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC. Definitely don't want to get these guys out there. And do people abuse the system? Absolutely, they do. It happens all the time, and most people are just going to settle on these from a court's perspective. But ultimately, regardless of whether or not what some people will do, we want to treat people with respect and excellence. Once again, kind of put that as your bar there. Are we treating people excellently? And if the answer to that is no, then maybe it's time to change a little bit the way that we're acting towards people, and whether that's female, male. Maybe it's somebody who, isn't very strong or kind of a weaker link, and so you're harassing them to kind of run them off, if you will. These sorts of things, it's not worth it. Guy's not making the team. Be a Phil Jackson, just cut him. Hey, this dude's not very good. We need to find somebody else. There's no reason to barrage somebody. Anyway, off the soapbox or harassment, it is against the law of sexual nature or otherwise. So definitely, treat people with respect and follow the rules there. So some key points to remember here. Harassment of any kind is prohibited by law and workplace policy. It involves more than physical contact. It can be verbal. It can even be visual. I was at a safety meeting one time, and I didn't really consider this harassment necessarily, but it definitely crossed some lines. A guy walks up to me, is like, hey, can we play this video in the safety meeting? And it was a video that was not appropriate for a safety meeting, children, probably 90% of the population. And I was just blown away. I was like, dude, we're cool, but, you can't be just showing me that at work without, just put it in my face. So, it can happen. Once again, I mean, I laughed it off. It was actually funny, but at the same time, from a bigger perspective, it's not funny. You got to be careful about how you engage people. Once again, respect, excellence, etc. You have the power to help prevent it, obviously, from your side. And if somebody's treating you or someone else bad, especially if you see somebody who's kind of in a victim role or kind of at the short end of the stick, if you will, be somebody who's willing to stand up for others. And as I mentioned, Basin's core values, one of them is supporting each other to put customers first. And if we're not supporting our team, then customer ultimately isn't getting the product and the service that they're wanting, or our employers aren't getting the product or service that they're wanting. So, treating people better ultimately is a better way to serve our customers. And also, once again, be an advocate if you see somebody being harassed. So kind of wrapping up on the disciplinary program as well, and alcohol and drugs, never be under the influence at work. If you have a problem, definitely reach out. That's important. Report anyone that is under the influence to your supervisor, or talk to them directly and say, hey man, looks like you need help. Like if you're using or still under the influence at work, like you may want to reach out to the employee assistance program and see if you want to get some help. Now, people are resistant to this. Once again, I mean, it's a tough decision to weigh, but we want people to be healthy, not just from a fruits and vegetables perspective, but also from a mental perspective as well. Disciplinary programs that protect you and the people around us. Treat other team members with respect and excellence, and then follow all the rules put forth by your company. If you're unsure, as I mentioned, look at your safety manuals and programs. They typically have a lot of information. I mean, I read mine every night before I go to bed. I'm just reading it out loud, just really enthralling reading. No, I'm joking, but no, I don't have any friends. No, I don't typically think that these are things that you're reading on a weekly basis, but definitely I got information in there and something to look over and really understand what's expected of you. So that's all we've got this month. As I mentioned, it's a shorter training. Appreciate you paying attention. As I mentioned, there'll be a quiz after this. I also have a download of the PowerPoint linked in there, so you can click that and download the PDF with some notes if you want to take notes. Really appreciate your attention, and we'll see you all in January.